Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are crossing borders.
Mm, but not the kind you find on a map with guards and treaties. We're diving straight into this really high-stakes intellectual conflict right at the heart of modern literary studies. And we're asking a question that honestly still sets off fire alarms in university hallways. Is literary theory a genuine radical political force, something designed to dismantle ideology? Or has it been neutralized? Has it just become another academic tool, another box you have to check to get your degree? The source material we're using to guide us through this intellectual minefield is brilliantly titled Border Crossings, or Close Encounters of the Textual Kind, by Julian Wolfries. And right away, Wolfries sets up this analogy that just perfectly frames the tension. He says that when literary theory showed up in the Anglo-American academic world, it was never treated like an invited guest, not at all. It was seen as, well, as an invasion. It was the unauthorized, maybe even dangerous immigrant trying to cross the sacred, very carefully patrolled borders of what was just called English literature.
So, our mission for this deep dive is, I think, pretty clear. We need to get at the deep ideological reasons why theory provoked such an intense reaction. We're talking fear, resentment, but also fascination. We're going to trace its journey from, the metaphorical wild countryside of radical politics into the tidy institutional world of the university. And, this is the crucial part, we'll look at the really surprising ways that theory keeps fighting back against its own domestication.
And to really get to the origin of that fear, you have to go back to this warning shot fired by the critic Terry Eagleton. We're talking all the way back in 1976. This is really the intellectual nugget that defines the whole anxiety. And Eagleton, he wasn't worried about French ideas per se. He was worried about translation. Specifically, the possibility, and he thought it was a very high probability, of seeing a powerful political movement, Marxism, get translated.
But not just translated from one language to another.
Exactly. This wasn't about German to English. It was a translation from the realm of potent, real-world political practice into what he just dismissed as a formalized and therefore totally diluted literary approach to texts.
A literary approach. So the political power of this massive ideology was being boiled down to a method.
Just a method, yes.
That distinction politics being reduced to method, that feels like everything, doesn't it? Eagleton is basically saying that to get into the university, the ideas had to be, housebroken, stripped of their danger.
Precisely. That's
Okay.
a perfect way to put it. He called this process entering the United States of criticism. And to get that entry visa, to get your permit into the land of literary studies, any radical idea had to be vetted, investigated, and vetoed where necessary. It was granted a place in the institution, sure, but only if it surrendered its most challenging, its most revolutionary edges.
So the institution essentially performs an act of intellectual quarantine right there at the border.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's stay with that idea of translation, that dilution for a minute, because Eagleton used this incredible metaphor to describe it. It was agricultural, almost.
It was, yeah. He framed the whole shift of Marxism into literary studies as a move from the country to the city.
From the country to the city. So what was the country supposed to represent? What was being lost in that move?
Well, the country here is symbolic. It stood for the wild and glorious countryside of ideological practice. It was untamed, maybe even a little anarchic. It was a space where political thought connected directly to labor, to class struggle, to material reality. It was critique before it got institutionalized.
Before it got put into a syllabus.
Exactly. So when this wild force was brought into the structured, curriculum-driven world of literary studies, it was transformed into, and this is his phrase, manageable soil, or even more cynically, a well-tilled field.
Wow. The implication there is just devastating.
It is. The dynamic, untamed potential for real change, the wildness of the idea, was carefully manicured. It was domesticated. It was turned into land that was ready for academic cultivation, which means it was made predictable, consumable, and most importantly, safe.
The political engine became an academic tool. The wilderness was turned into a cash crop for the university to harvest.
That's it. But Eagleton didn't just see the landscape changing. He saw the people changing, too. The students who would inherit this managed soil. And that leads to his really cynical vision of the tramping students.
Right. Tell me about that.
His initial vision was just profoundly pessimistic. He worried about hordes of ramblers just pursuing their path unthinkingly across this now fertile, arable land.
The revolutionary spirit is gone.
It's gone. It's been replaced by routine, a mandatory academic exercise. Students would walk the path of Marxist literary criticism, not because they were revolutionaries, but because, it was on the exam.
They're just following the trail markers without ever asking who put them there.
Exactly. And he uses this topographical image of trespass, but it's an ironic one.
Hmm.
The initial boundary was broken to let the wild idea in, but in the process, the rich soil of genuine ideological practice gets churned up and diminished by just sheer academic repetition.
So the pure idea gets diluted and worn down by the institution's routine.
Yes, it's a very bleak picture.
Okay, so you have this complex thought just getting flattened by the university system. You have Eagleton in 76 as the alarmed woodsman watching this happen. But then the story takes this wonderful, ironic turn
It does.
because Eagleton himself becomes the great popularizer of the very thing he was warning against.
That is the delicious irony that shapes this whole debate. Because only 7 years after he wrote that dire warning, in 1983, Terry Eagleton publishes Literary Theory, an introduction.
And this wasn't just some small academic book.
Oh, not at all. This was a monumental book. For an entire generation of students, this book defined literary study in Great Britain and really beyond. He essentially went from being the critic watching in disbelief as these day trippers trampled his intellectual land to being an active participant.
He became the guy helping to pave the path.
He was helping in the reconstruction of the landscape he had just lamented was being destroyed.
So if that agrarian metaphor, the wild country being tamed for intellectual tourism, kind of reaches its limit when the woodsman himself starts paving the road, the imagery has to change.
It has to.
And the source material suggests we move away from fields and soil and towards something much more architectural, imposing.
That's right. The metaphor shifts from the wild field to this undeniable urban architecture of established culture. See, when Eagleton wrote his introduction, he knew that for theory to make its case, it had to first account for the thing it was theorizing, literature itself. And his conclusion was that literature isn't some natural, pure thing. It relies for its very identity on a complex and interrelated series of value judgments. And all of those judgments, they go back to deeper structures of belief.
And this is where the new metaphor comes in.
This is where it comes in. He described the roots of these beliefs, the ideological assumptions holding up our whole concept of literature as being as apparently unshakable as the Empire State Building.
The Empire State Building, that's a powerful image. It's not just about permanence. It suggests scale, visibility, a huge foundational cost.
Exactly. I mean, whether a skyscraper has literal roots is beside the point. The implication is that literature and its cultural and institutional maintenance is supported by this massive, urban, seemingly unshakable structure.
It has sheer mass. It dominates the skyline. You can't ignore it.
You can't. And so theory's purpose shifts. It has to comprehend this imposing structure. It has to analyze the foundations of the text and understand the deeper structures that the very idea of literature is built on.
So it's not about saving the wild country anymore.
No, it's about mapping the ideological city.
And that raises the stakes quite a bit. The goal isn't just to preserve a political practice, it's to understand the entire ideological skyscraper our culture lives in. Which brings us to the really fundamental question Eagleton asked. What is the point of literary theory? If it's not just about, reading a poem better, what is its essential purpose?
Well, the short answer is that literature is not value-free. And it's not just a matter of aesthetic evaluation.
Meaning, you can't just say a poem is great because it's beautiful.
Right, a traditional critic might say that,
Yeah.
but Eagleton pushes back. He argues that aesthetics themselves, our very definitions of beauty, of value, of formal success, are not somehow outside of politics or economics.
Your taste isn't innocent.
Your taste is not innocent.
Yeah.
He argues pretty trenchantly that the entire history of modern literary theory is part of the political and ideological history of our epoch. So theory isn't just its own little field of study, like linguistics. It is a specific, politically charged lens through which we have to view the history of our times. It's completely bound up with political beliefs, ideological values, and all the power struggles happening right outside the classroom window.
That really challenges the comfortable idea of the English department as this quiet oasis of humanist learning.
It does.
If you accept Eagleton's premise, it means that literature departments aren't neutral. They aren't just purveyors of great stories. They're active parts of a political and economic structure.
Yes.
I mean, that's a strong claim that these departments are part of the ideological apparatus of the modern capitalist state. Isn't that a bit extreme? How does the source defend the idea that teaching Keats is actually a form of political alignment?
It is a very strong claim, and it all hinges on what you mean by ideological apparatus. Eagleton is pointing out that the institution of literature and how it's taught conventionally exists to perpetuate and normalize the ruling ideas of a society.
So when we talk about literature having some timeless universal value.
Right. When we say that, we're usually talking about values like individualism or linear progress or certain ideas of self-determination. And those values are inherently products of the societies we live in, of the economic systems that maintain them.
So theory's job isn't just to offer another approach.
No, it's a critical practice designed specifically to expose that ideological apparatus, to question the very idea that literature has this immutable universal value, and to reveal it instead as being the product of these broader discursive and ideological practices. In short, theory doesn't just read the book. It reads the system that produced the book and the department that teaches it.
Okay, let's make that more concrete. The feminist theorist is used as an example of how this kind of political reading becomes necessary. Why is a traditional reading that just ignores gender seriously defective?
Okay, sure. Think about a traditional non-theorized reading of a classic novel, say, something from the Victorian era. The conventional critic might focus on the beauty of the prose, the plot, the, universality of human suffering.
Right. They might see Ophelia in Hamlet as just a tragic character who moves the plot forward.
Exactly. But the feminist theorist starts from the premise that gender and sexuality are central, shaping themes in all forms of discourse. And they argue that to suppress that analysis makes any critical account seriously defective.
Because it's ignoring the very structures that require Ophelia to fail in the first place.
Yes, the sociolinguistic structures that define the very limited roles available to women in that society. So it's not about just adding a political layer on top. The argument is that the old formalist analysis is fundamentally incomplete because it ignores the structural reality of power that's encoded in the text itself.
And this idea of invisible power structures leads directly to Eagleton's warning about colonization. If departments are ideological apparatuses, then uncritical reading is. It's a political act against the reader.
Absolutely. Eagleton warns that theory has to resist becoming this single predictable thing that can be easily absorbed by what he calls the ideological state apparatus. If radical thought falls into the wrong hands, meaning the hands of the dominant political order, it stops being radical. Instantly. It becomes a tool.
A tool for?
A tool for the intensive colonization of the subject.
And who is the colonized subject?
It's us. It's the students, the readers, who are disciplined and contained within these social modes of production and consumption. When you, the reader, are told through a traditional education that literature has this small range of timeless humanist values that you must comprehend, well, you're essentially being asked to accept those values as objective truth.
You're absorbing an ideology without even realizing it.
That is the act of reader colonization.
I get the warning, but when theory tries to resist that, doesn't it risk becoming its own dogmatic ideology? Just swapping one set of values for another?
That is the essential critique, and the source addresses it by stressing that true theory has to stay radical and dynamic. By refusing to be formalized, theory provides forms of resistance to colonization, precisely because it understands the cultural, historical, and material aspects of texts. That image of colonization, the forceful takeover of a mind or a state, it speaks directly to the border crossings we're talking about.
Yeah.
For Eagleton, theory was all about keeping radical ideas alive in the face of institutional erasure. It's about understanding how borders get built in the first place.
So if theory's purpose is inherently political, then the backlash against it, the fear of theory, makes perfect sense. It's the fear of having your own empire state building of belief get rattled.
Completely.
But let's trace the physical origin of this disruptive force. It challenged the borders of English literature, but the consensus is that it arrived from elsewhere.
Yes, that idea of the foreign import is absolutely central to the whole controversy. The dominant story identifies theory, especially in its most disruptive forms like post-structuralism, deconstruction, psychoanalytic criticism, as a direct import of French theoretical discourses from the 1960s.
So these ideas were translated.
They were translated, often a bit clumsily or selectively, and they entered English departments in the U.S. and Britain, usually through specific conferences or visiting academics.
But it wasn't just a French thing.
No, not at all. The landscape was more complex. You also had German incursions, things like reader response theory, the critical sociology of the Frankfurt School.
Adorno, Horkheimer.
Right. But because the clash with French post-structuralism was so spectacular and so linguistically challenging, the simple popular narrative just emphasizes those Francophone origins as the main source of the invasion.
It sounds less like intellectual tourism and more like a hostile takeover by guests who refuse to go home.
That sentiment really captures the attitude of a lot of traditionalists. These theoretical discourses were described as arriving, maybe as temporary visitors, and then dressing themselves up in Anglo-American guise and having the nerve to stay long after the visa expired.
Cultural squatters.
Basically, yes. And the changes they brought about in literary studies have lasted for generations. English departments were fundamentally and permanently altered by this settlement.
And one of the commentators, Michael Payne, he characterized this as nothing less than a paradigm shift. He compared it to the big breaks in science, meaning the old way of doing things was suddenly obsolete. What did that look like in practice?
Payne saw changes that were fundamental and far-reaching. First, the actual material being studied changed. It wasn't just reading more books, it was about deliberately enlarging the canon to include writers who'd been marginalized because of their race, gender, or nationality.
Okay, and the second big change.
The second was the very definition of what counted as a critical text. Critics started bringing in work from figures who were usually kept in other departments: philosophers, psychoanalysts, historians.
So Foucault, Freud, Derrida.
Exactly. They used to be just background reading. Now they were being studied as texts, central to understanding literature itself. The borders between disciplines were just being erased.
That seems like a pretty logical and enriching evolution, but the sources say the backlash was immediate and intense. Why did so many established writers and teachers see this as dangerous and anti-humanistic?
The resistance came down to two big overlapping fears. The first was just a fear of the foreign. It played heavily on a kind of cultural nationalism. The fear of theory was fundamentally the fear of the alien, the intruder. Specifically, continental philosophy, which was seen as dense, abstract, hopelessly political, and the total opposite of the good old homegrown varieties.
Like the analytical tradition in Britain or pragmatism in the US?
Exactly. Theory was feared, like so many illegal immigrants, threatening the cultural and linguistic purity of the discipline. People talked about the contamination of English with all this trendy foreign jargon.
And the second major fear was just the intellectual affront of difficulty.
Right.
If literature is supposed to be timeless and accessible, why is the language we use to talk about it so dense?
That difficulty was a huge sticking point. It was a challenge to established authority. I mean, the canon, the sacred texts, they're supposed to be part of our shared cultural heritage, something we can all understand.
But if the theory you need to discuss it is hard to understand.
That it feels like the critic is deliberately hiding something, obfuscating. The detractors argued that literature should just be taught historically, or for its timeless, formal, and aesthetic qualities. Things that supposedly transcend culture and politics. They wanted a static sense of value, not a dynamic interrogation of it.
So they saw theory as this chaotic, multilingual noise.
Yes, that's it. They described it as a Babylonian horde not even waiting at the checkpoints to have its passport stamped, just invading the academic space.
That image, the multilingual mob ignoring border control, is incredibly vivid. And K.M. Newton takes that even further, right? He frames the whole world of literary criticism as a political arena, a parliament of criticism.
That political analogy is so important for understanding the stakes. Newton says that literary criticism used to be like a parliament, dominated by just two big, predictable parties.
The traditionalists and the historical biographers, maybe?
Something like that, yes. A stable two-party system. You knew what you were getting. But theory's arrival completely shattered that stability. Suddenly, numerous small parties have entered the parliament. You have Marxists, feminists, queer theorists, post-colonial critics, and no single party has an overall majority anymore.
And that shift from a stable two-party system to this fragmented political landscape, that must fundamentally change the nature of the work itself.
Absolutely. It reveals literary criticism for what it is at its core, a struggle for power among parties. The debate stops being this genteel discussion about aesthetics and becomes a high-stakes conflict over curriculum, over resources, over what even counts as valid intellectual work.
It makes the hidden ideological battle lines explicit.
Exactly. It directly challenges those high-minded cultural definitions of what is best to be known and taught.
So the border's been crossed. The mother country of English literature has been infiltrated. But institutions representing that dominant social order, they don't just surrender. They fight back with their own strategies to quieten this threat. What were the two key strategies for containment?
The institutional response was very calculated and had two main parts, both aimed at neutralizing the radical edge. The first was isolation, or quarantine. and the second was absorption, or what you could call formalist domestication.
Let's start with quarantine. That sounds like they're creating a special holding cell for the dangerous ideas.
That's exactly what it is. Theory was given its rabies shots, put into quarantine, by creating dedicated courses, you know, Literary Theory 101 or Critical Approaches. So you, the student, are required to take this class where you learn about structuralism one week, Marxism the next.
If this is week 6, it must be feminism.
Right. And the institution can then say, convincingly, see, we teach theory. But by creating this defined space, they effectively isolate it. They wall it off from the core literature classes.
So it becomes just one more subject to study, not a fundamental way of thinking.
Exactly. It's reduced to an adjunct of literary studies, an optional course, or worse, just a series of approaches. It removes the necessity for students to actually engage with Shakespeare or the Victorian novel from these perspectives in all their classes.
So you put it in a box, and that neutralizes the border crossing threat.
Precisely.
Which brings us to strategy 2, the more insidious one: absorption. This is the idea where theory seems to have won, but it's been totally defanged. Captured in that phrase, these days most academics are, to some extent, theorized.
Yes. You hear that all the time in departments. It suggests the ideological battle is over, theory has been integrated, everything's fine now. But it's a very complex form of institutional victory, because theory had been consumed, rendered pretty ineffectual, and reduced, again, to just a series of formalist tools.
The idea being that if everyone is theorized, then you don't need the messy political debates anymore.
The revolutionary edge can be safely erased, yes.
Let's use the Foucault example from the source to break this down. How does a radical critique of power become just a safe thematic checklist?
Okay, so take the revolutionary work of Michel Foucault. He launched this radical critique of power, knowledge, discursive practices. His work is complex. It's about how language itself maintains systems of oppression. But through institutional absorption, the anglicization of his foreign identity, that rigorous philosophical study gets replaced with something much more accessible and, crucially, much safer.
So instead of analyzing the rhetoric,
The theory gets simplified into studying easily identifiable themes or images. The study of images of the body, or images of incarceration, or acts of policing, and so on.
so the classroom assignment goes from analyze how the narrative structure enacts disciplinary power to find all the pictures of prisons in this novel.
Exactly. The names are new, but the method is old. It reverts to a conventional thematic search. The radical critique of how power works is replaced by just identifying the visible signs of power. Foucault's name gets used, but his political rigor is silenced.
And we see the same thing happening with feminist criticism.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Feminist theory poses this huge fundamental challenge to systemic patriarchy. But in the classroom, it's so often reduced to merely the examination of the depiction of women, of female characters, and women writers.
It becomes a thematic checklist again.
It does. This formalist domestication just swaps old figures of analysis for new ones. But the underlying principle is the same. The reader is just looking for content, not critically engaging with the structure that creates it. The institution wins by turning a revolution into a predictable, testable tool.
So the final analysis of why theory is a threat isn't really intellectual. It's existential. It challenges your own identity.
That is the core political argument. Theory is only a threat if you fear being asked to think differently from the usual tired, complacent habits of thought and belief, which can come to constitute an identity for you without your awareness. And those institutional mechanisms, quarantine, formalism, they're designed specifically to stop that fundamental identity-disrupting reflection from ever happening.
But theory, by its very nature, refuses to stay in that neat little box. If the institution tries so hard to define and contain it, does that definition ever actually stick? Or does theory just keep recrossing the border?
It is fundamentally too dynamic. It's too energetically charged to be contained by a single course title. The critical theories have repeatedly, energetically, and ceaselessly formed and reformed themselves. They are always in motion. And this reveals the big mistake the anti-theorists make. They assume literary theory is a single monolithic thing.
But the title itself is an act of institutional border patrol.
It is. It's a form of domestication used to silence and erase differences, to hide the internal arguments, and to ignore the sheer heterogeneity and protein energies that exist not just between theories, but within them.
That idea of protein energy is fascinating. It's constantly changing shape. So a theory like feminism today looks nothing like feminism from 40 years ago.
Exactly. And different strands of feminism disagree fiercely with each other. The source mentions Ruth Robbins' rhetorical question, Will the real feminist theory please stand up?
Hmm.
And it's impossible to answer because there is no single, true, stable feminist theory. There are materialist feminisms, psychoanalytic feminisms, intersectional feminisms, on and on.
And that inability to be pinned down, that's the threat.
That is its central threat. It resists all institutional efforts at simple identification. The Border Patrol can't issue a single authoritative visa.
So it's not a single it, and its strength is in this constant flow, making it impossible to pin down. A bit like Roland Barthes himself.
Absolutely. Theories don't exist as warring factions fighting for some utopian consensus. They exist in a state of productive tension, constantly redrawing their own boundaries, influencing each other.
So postmodernism isn't one simple thing.
Not at all. Its discourses span architecture, philosophy, literature. And Roland Barthes himself, you couldn't just call him a structuralist critic. He was always moving, always outgrowing the label. And we see these spectacular examples of theoretical cross-pollination everywhere.
Okay, give us some examples of that intertextual border crossing. Where do the lines get really blurry?
We'll take Paul de Man. His influence is so vast, his work shows up in sections on deconstruction, on post-structuralism, and even on reader response theory. He just resists categorization. Or Terry Castle's amazing essay, The Apparitional Lesbian. It belongs just as much to feminist theory as it does to queer theory. The boundaries are completely porous.
And the biggest example would have to be Derrida.
Of course, Jacques Derrida. His influence is everywhere, implicit or explicit, in so many seemingly separate fields. Feminism, queer theory, post-colonial discourse, post-structuralism. He provides a critical vocabulary that lets people in all those fields conduct their own border crossings.
So the theoretical apparatus isn't stuck in its lecture hall. By constantly remapping its own boundaries, it highlights the unspoken assumptions that create an identity in the first place.
Exactly. And that dynamic vitality, that energy is what fundamentally troubles those who need the institutional definition of literary theory to keep it contained and in its place. The very act of naming it is an attempt at building a border, but the theory just keeps passing right through it.
This brings us to the most profound challenge, which Peggy Camus articulated in relation to deconstruction. If the institution tries to define something like deconstruction as a localizable thing that can be opposed or excluded, what is the theory actually revealing?
Camus suggests that while institutions are busy policing borders, what's far more interesting is the revelation of a certain unfigurable space, the space for different kinds of effects.
Yeah.
This is the intellectual terrain that can't be mapped. It can't be contained or defined by any existing academic classification.
And this unfigurable space is the real source of the hostility.
It is, because its revelation counters the tidy, formalized thinking the institution relies on. It signifies the emergence of these new channels of communication that pass easily across all those imagined borders, linking ideas and disciplines that were supposed to stay separate.
And opening up that space leads directly to the creation of brand new politically charged fields that the institution never saw coming, like post-colonial theory or cultural studies.
Exactly. When you allow that intellectual movement, that constant border crossing, it inevitably leads to new forms of political thinking. Post-colonial theory, queer theory, cultural studies, they're all direct results of this process. They adapted the radical discourses and crossed the borders of traditional literary study. And they demand that literature be read as a symptom of power, not just a beautiful artifact. And this is why this whole process results in this powerful demand on the reader, the urgency of rereading.
The urgency of rereading. So we're not just applying new tools to old books, we're fundamentally changing how we encounter the text itself.
That is the ultimate goal. These practices reinvent textual encounters. They're not just about what we read, but more importantly, how we reread what we've already been told how to read. We're talking about taking canonical works by Jane Austen or Shakespeare or Rudyard Kipling and encountering them as fresh, active, ideologically loaded documents, not just cultural monuments.
The goal is to emancipate the differences of the text.
Yes, to read with energy and urgency, to expose the textual structures, the historical baggage, the ideological containment that a traditional reading just tries to smooth over. It's that constant redrawing of political and textual lines that is theory's essential, vital response to the perpetual danger of being enclosed and domesticated by the institution.
This has been a tremendously insightful deep dive into how literary theory fights to stay political, revolutionary, and and just dynamically undefinable instead of becoming just another required course.
Well, the core tension we started with is really what defines its longevity. Literary theory is feared not just because it's complex, though it often is, but because it challenges established values, fixed institutional borders, and the stable fixed identities, both political and textual, that institutions rely on. Its intellectual survival, really, lies entirely in its refusal to be a single, static thing. It has to function as this dynamic, protean force that constantly crosses epistemological, political, and critical borders, always resisting the institution's relentless urge to put it in a safe labeled box.
Okay, let's unpack this and pull it entirely outside the humanities for a moment. If theory is, at its heart, a political and ideological lens for looking at texts and culture, and if we accept that institutional forces, and I mean that in the broadest sense, so corporate media, political parties, maybe even the established norms in your own workplace, are always seeking to domesticate radical thought into a non-threatening checklist, then the ultimate act of critical thinking, for you, the listener, is to always question the borders we accept. We've established that the deepest structures of belief are as apparently unshakable as the Empire State Building. They are visible, immense, and constantly maintained. So we'll leave you with this provocative question. What unshakable Empire State Building of belief do you rely upon in your daily reading of the news, of professional research, or even just casual media that might be right for a border crossing? What assumption about the way things are done or what makes something valuable could be exposed as merely a formalized, domesticated tool, just waiting for radical, untamed reading? Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.